It's so good to see you all here this morning. It really is. As Glenn said, we're church family. And I feel really privileged today to be giving our Remembrance service message. Sorry, I'm just going to organise myself because I just get a little bit comfortable. On the way to church this morning, on the way to get Karen actually, an ambulance passed by me. And I was amazed to see a huge banner along the side of the ambulance with a picture of poppies and the 3 words, "Lest we forget." I thought my dad would have been pleased about that. And I want to speak to you about lest we forget, because they are 3 very short but very powerful words. And it was those 3 words, lest we forget, that literally leapt off his page of his Bible as he was reading it. Rudyard Kipling. Everybody heard of Rudyard Kipling? Yeah? Even the younger ones may have. Rudyard Kipling was reading his Bible. I don't know where he was when he was reading his Bible, and I don't know which Bible he was reading, because I've seen that he had several. How do I know that? Because I've been to Bateman's, his home. Anybody been to Bateman's out at Burwash? Fantastic. When you go into his study, actually, have you ever felt this when you're walking in historical places and you think, as I walk on the floorboards, the same boards that he put his feet on? It's a funny experience. And I remember walking into his huge study. It was lined with books all the way round. There were Bibles there. He had a massive desk that overlooked the beautiful countryside and the beautiful grounds there. And there was his quill and his ink and his blotter there and his various books on the desk. And I could imagine him sitting there reading, reflecting, meditating, and getting inspired and ready to write. And so there he was, reading these 3 words, lest we forget. And he read them from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 12. And I'm going to read you a little bit around the context of those words. And it's actually Moses who was speaking. And the scripture there says this: "Lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage." Lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Now this was Moses speaking to his people, all right? You can imagine him standing there, and there would be an assembly of people in front of him. And what he was doing when he said, "Lest you forget," he was warning them and he was cautioning them. Because you see, Moses had looked with his eyes into the future, and he knew that there was a time coming. And in the previous verses there, just before he said that, he was thinking about that time when God would fulfill his promise to bring his people out of captivity and into the land of freedom, into the promised land. But he says to the people, he says this, he says, "One day you will live in large and beautiful cities that you have not built. You will live in houses full of good things that you did not put there." He said, "You will drink from wells that you have not dug, and you will eat from vineyards and you will eat olives that you have not planted." And I think the reason why he was saying that was that he knew that when that time came, when they were happy, when they were free in the promised land, that they would forget. That they would forget that it was God who'd brought them out of captivity. When they were free, when they were happy, when they were satisfied, and when they were full, they would forget. And they would forget God's goodness. And they would actually, as we saw, fall into disobedience. So they didn't actually heed Moses' warning, did they? They would forget the time that they stood on the shores of the Red Sea with the thunder of hooves coming up behind them. And the only thing that would save them was be a miracle. And God did that miracle when he opened the Red Sea, when he parted those waters so that they could walk through on dried ground into their future. Not just their future, but their children's future, and their children's future, and their children's future. But they forgot. They forgot. And I spoke last time on how the word speaks to us, didn't I? How you can pick up your Bible and that word speaks so powerfully into our lives. And those 3 words, lest you forget, so spoke to Rudyard Kipling, the same as it did when Moses wrote those words. And he saw it as a prophetic warning to his nation, to this nation. Because like Moses, he saw a nation that was boasting in its own strength, in its own power, in its own might, and forgetting to acknowledge God, forgetting to have that attitude of gratitude towards God. Now, he wrote a poem, and I don't know if anybody here has ever read it. It's called The Recessional. Jeff, you're a very learned man. Have you read The Recessional? I suggest you go home and read it, because I know that you will get a lot out of it. I don't know, it might have been, but I didn't see it, because you weren't allowed to get too close. They had cordoned it off, so you couldn't go and touch anything, as it were. But yes, you'd like that, Jeff, I know you would. But I believe that from the very heart of Rudyard Kipling, when he wrote it, it's called a poem, but I don't think it is a poem. I think it's actually a very powerful and prophetic prayer that came right from in here as he read those words, and he was inspired. He was inspired by the biblical text that was in front of him. And actually, when you read it, it speaks of the utter foolishness of mankind. And it urges us not to forget, not to trust in our own resourcefulness, not to trust in our own strength and in our own power, but to continually, always look to God. So today in 2021, Rudyard Kipling's words still speak. They're on the side of an ambulance. They're on the top of your Facebook banner. They're everywhere you look. Particularly this year, I've noticed those words more and more, and they're spoken all around the world. So they've been adopted and used as a reminder to never forget our past. Never forget those who sacrificed their lives for us, and also those who were sacrificed for the sake of our freedom. So today, as Remembrance Day, is the day when we do remember all of those who served their king, their queen, their country, to defend our democratic rights, actually. They stood their ground and they defended our freedom and our way of life that we perhaps would not have today. We often don't think about that. We take it so for granted, don't we? So it's only right that we honour all of those who played their part in and lost their lives in the war effort. At the front there, we've got our own war memorial. We didn't know it was a war memorial when we moved in because it was so overgrown and covered with all these bushes. And me, liking a little bit of gardening, said, I'm just going to do something with that. And as I cut all the rosemary back, I realised there were these steps. And then I realised there was a little plaque. And I brushed it all off, and then I read it and realised that it was a memorial to those who'd lost their lives. Actually, in your families, maybe you know of your grandparents or your great-grandparents that served in the war, some who served on the front line, some who served in the air, flying the planes, or they worked in the field hospitals. I know that my grandmother did. She worked in the field hospitals looking after the wounded. Maybe they were firemen, paramedics, pilots, nurses. These are people that were in your family. Do you know your history? Do you know? I've only been finding out about mine since my father died, sadly. I wish I'd known a lot more. So in my family, I've got some really precious photographs of my grandfathers and my grandmother's brothers, all in various different uniforms, all black and white, nothing in colour, of course, all black and white. And it's quite amazing. And of course, my own dad was very involved in not forgetting. And he joined up to the War Graves Society that help families find the graves of their long-lost relatives. So often when I would go to my mum and dad's, my dad would be at his computer in his little office there, and he would be searching, Googling, looking through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names to find the grave of this one soldier. So that then when he found it, he'd identified it, whether it was in Ypres or Tynecott or wherever over there in France and Belgium. He would then take the family of that soldier over there, and he would lead them to the place where that grave was. He would then take them to Ypres, to the Menin Gate. Has anybody ever been to the Menin Gate? Okay, you've been to the Menin Gate. Now, the Menin Gate was chosen as a memorial place because hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through the Menin Gate there in Ypres in Belgium on their way to the battlefields. And of course, many never came back through that gate. There were 54,389 officers and men who died in the Ypres area alone, and there were 90,000 unknown men who died, but they were never found. And so there is, on the memorial, it says the unknown soldier, and there's another little text which I'll give you later on. Now, at Ypres, at the Menin Gate, at 7:30 every night, the police arrive, and they stop the traffic, and they clear the area, and there will be people moving in towards the Menin Gate, and then the buglers would arrive in their uniforms, and they would stand in a line there. And it's a very sobering moment. I mean, we've had our own sober moment just a minute ago. And then they would raise those bugles to their mouths, and they would play the last post, and then there would be a minute's silence. And the town of Ypres are used to this. I mean, it would feel quite strange, wouldn't it, I think? But the town of Ypres are used to this because they want to still honour all of those soldiers that passed through their town, and also those soldiers that actually held that line. Ypres was very, very important in holding that line. So that has happened every single night in all weathers since 1929. Can you imagine that? In all weathers since 1929, except for 4 years between 1940 and 1944 when there was German occupation there. And I was there in Ypres with my mum and dad, sitting, having just had an evening meal in the town square of Ypres. And my dad stood up and he said, I'm going to the Menin Gate. He said, do you want to come with me, Catherine? And I looked outside, and it was dark, and it was chucking it down with rain. And I said, no, it's all right, Dad. I'll stay here with Mum. And I regret that I didn't go. Now, I regret that I didn't go, because I realise how much it meant to him, and I regret putting my own personal comfort first. It was only rain, it was only a few moments of my time to honour those who gave so much for me. So my dad went on his own, and he stood there in the pouring rain, as he did many years. In fact, 1 year on Remembrance Day, and he would have been there today, I went round to my mum and looked after Mum because Dad had gone away, so I stayed overnight. And we were watching the BBC News, and I suddenly said, there's Dad. And there was my dad, smartly dressed, with my granddad's medals on his coat, and he was holding his wreath very solemnly. And the camera panned in, and as they played the last post, I saw my dad's bottom lip tremble as he tried to keep himself together. My dad had a habit of getting on the BBC News. Some of you know what that means. So that was my regret, really. But Rudyard Kipling also had a regret. He carried the guilt of pulling strings to get his son Jack into the army. Now, Jack shouldn't have got in. If he'd gone through the medical, he would have actually failed because he had very, very bad eyesight. So he wouldn't have been accepted. And so Rudyard, little bit of here, little conversation there, and Jack got in. But Jack died. Jack died on the battlefield. He died at the Battle of Luz, and his body was never ever found. He was one of those unknown soldiers. He could still have been alive, couldn't he, if his father hadn't used his influence. And it is said that Rudyard Kipling was never quite the same after that. He carried that within him, and he poured his guilt into words when he wrote, "If anyone question why we died, tell them it was because our fathers lied." You can feel the pain in that, can't you? You can really feel the pain. And of course, war has its price. It will always mean loss of lives. But for many soldiers who have served, and we've had our own veterans, and we have somebody at the moment who served in the war, and we've known many of them who will privately say that the war may have ended, but they are still in a battle. They are still in a battle. Their families are also still in a battle. They're in a battle for their own mental health because they may have left the battlefield, but the battle goes on as they try to re-enter into civilian life. Now, Carl isn't here today with us. He wasn't feeling very well. But on the Alpha course, and he has shared with several of us that he joined the army at the age of 16. I have permission to tell you this. Age of 16, that is so young, isn't it? And he served with the Devon and Dorset Regiment in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he said to us in our group, he said, no one prepares you for that. He says they don't prepare you for the experience of war, and no one prepares you for the aftermath of fighting a war. And you see, many years ago, those young men, when war was declared, rushed to defend their king and their country, and many of them lied about their age. You know, and I often think of those mothers thinking, well, my son will be safe, because he's only 16. But they went and they lied, and they came back and they said to those mothers, I'm going, Mum, I'm going to go and do my bit. You know, I'm going to go and defend my country. So many came back and have found it hard to adjust, as will many, I suspect, returning from Afghanistan recently. Prince Harry himself said this week that war stays with you like a slideshow of images. Now, every year on Remembrance Day, when we stand here and we have our silence and we remember, my mind is always drawn to thinking about the women. The women. And I put myself in their place. You know, they watched their husbands, their sons, their fathers, their brothers, their fiancés, their uncles leave for war, and they didn't know if they were going to come back. They didn't know if they would see them again. And 9.7 million soldiers were killed in the Great War alone. And that means that 1/3 of those, on average, left a widow and 2 children behind. And I can't begin to imagine living with the knowledge of knowing that a knock on the door could mean that you've been told that your loved one has died in defending their country. I can't imagine what it was like for those that received those telegrams. And for many streets, you know, neighbours were very close. It was such a community. And you would find that Mrs. Jones across the road has just had a telegram. Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Smith has just had a telegram. Now, in 1939, there was a motivational poster produced by the British government. They knew what was about to happen. They knew the Blitz was coming, when there would be mass bombings on our cities. And they knew that it was quite likely that poisonous gas was going to be also dropped on our cities. They knew there was going to be an incredible loss of life. And so to boost public morale, they produced a poster. The poster said, "Keep calm and carry on." Know that one? Yeah, we've seen it a lot recently. There's a whole story to that, and I won't go into it, but if you want to know, just look it up. It's an incredible story to that. Keep calm and carry on. And that's what you had to do. You had to, despite living under the shadow of hardship and loss. But many turned to their faith. My own grandfather wrote a letter to my grandmother urging her to keep going to church and to keep taking the children to church. And I've got that was my great-grandmother actually. I've got some incredible photographs of her, you know, in your really old-fashioned dress. And they never smiled, did they, in those days? They never smiled. And you don't know whether it was just not the dumb thing or just like life was so hard and they couldn't smile. And many read their pocket Bibles in the trenches, many prayed, and many thanked God for the protection. Many thanked God for another day that they were alive. There are even stories of supernatural protection. And I'm going to read you one. I found it, and I loved it. It's called The Gift of Tongues. And it's by a man called Joseph R. Banks, who had this happen to him. And he actually recorded that, and it's out there in print. What happened was he and 3 other soldiers escaped a Nazi prisoner of war camp in World War II. And then as they were stumbling through the forest dark at night, through this little village, a German soldier suddenly appeared and started yelling at them. And Banks says, before I could think of what to do, I was startled to hear myself respond with a calm, confident German phrase that was obviously appropriate to what he had just said to me. The German soldier looked at him and said, "Ja, ja, ja," and then went back into the house. So they were quickly able to hurry away into the darkness and escape. So his friends turned around and said, "What did you say to him?" He said, "I have no idea. I have no idea." He said, "I don't speak German. I didn't understand what he said, and I didn't understand what I said." So in his little piece where I found this story, he says this. He says, in the church, we hear of the gift of tongues, but this was truly an instance of the Lord putting words in one's mouth. God was present on the battlefields and in the trenches. I'm going to read you a poem. Actually, you know how I love poetry before I go on to the last piece of this message. It's called In the Foxhole, and it was written by a soldier in the foxhole in 1945. He did sadly die, but this poem that he wrote out as a recount of what happened to him, really, was then printed up, and so you can read it today. And it was about how he found God. He says, "Christ, I thought I knew all the answers until madness started this war. I never gave you a second thought, nor even talked to you before. The age-old story of Bethlehem and the drama of Calvary were nothing more than mere fairy tales. Yes, Lord, mere fairy tales to me. But tonight my helmet is heavy, and so is the pack on my back. Barbed wire has left me 2 torn hands, and my feet leave a bloody track. My shoulders sag underneath this heavy gun, and my body is weary with pain. My whole tortured being cries out for rest and release, but in vain. For the first time in my life, I know your head hurt from a thorny crown, and your tired, bleeding shoulders ached when that heavy cross weighed you down. Those nails cut into your hands and feet. Every inch of your flesh was torn, and your bruised body was weary. My God, once you too were careworn. But you didn't quit, you carried on until the grim battle was through, and now I know you did it for me, so I'll go on fighting for you. I want you to know that I'm sorry. It was my sins that put you to death, and I'll keep on saying I'm sorry until I draw my last breath. It's powerful, isn't it? Now in Acts chapter 15 and verse 18, there is a small piece of scriptural text there, and it says, known unto God. You can look that up. And Rudyard Kipling again found this piece of scripture and again was inspired. You see, after Jack died, he was so weighed down that he felt that he wanted to contribute, to do something. And so he joined up and he was asked to join the War Graves Commission, the Imperial War Graves Commission, and to input and give something to that. And so he found this little phrase, known unto God, and he felt inspired, and he felt that it was an appropriate text to be carved into each of the graves, in each of the white stone on the war graves, so that every soldier who couldn't be identified, who were unknown, but known to God, known unto God, every single one of them, even Jack, Rudyard Kipling's son. Has anybody here ever visited the war graves? You have. I have, in Tynecott and in Ypres with my dad. And you're always struck how immaculate the grounds are. It's like every bit of green grass, every blade of grass has its place. And of course you'll see that families still visit there and lay wreaths or lay flowers, but it is immaculate, unlike our church grounds where we see they're overgrown. Do you remember that one in Oxford? Completely overgrown. You know, families probably don't ever visit there anymore. So I found it quite amazing. And as you travel through the area and you go down through the motorway, along the side of the motorway, you'll see all these poppies along the side of the motorway. And as you get closer, you'll see fields of bright red poppies. You see, the man-made roads that we have now just cover the battlefield. They cover the mud, the never-ending mud, the bleak, barren and destroyed ground of that area all through France and Belgium. And there wasn't much that could grow there, but poppies could. And so you'd see these bright red, delicate little flowers pushing through the earth. And they were like a symbol of resilience. They were a symbol of hope almost in the midst of such chaos and destruction. And of course now they have become the symbol of remembrance. And every man, woman and child that lost their life because of war were loved by somebody. They were loved by somebody. All had a mother, all had a father, had children, had families. They were known by them, but they were known and loved by God himself. In fact, we know, don't we, as Christians, that God so loved us that he sacrificed his own son, Jesus Christ, for us. Jesus went willingly to lay his life down for us. But we remember also, as we took communion this morning, that in his humanity, he cried out to God, Father, if you can take this cup from me, if I couldn't have to do what I need to do now, if you could take it from me, but not my will be done, but yours. You see, he knew what he was about to suffer in the battle between good and evil. And he knew that he was going to suffer, but he was willing to do it on behalf of the whole of mankind. It was the only way. And the difference is that Jesus did not just die for his family. He didn't just die for his friends or for his king or his country. He died for his enemies as well. He died for his enemies. And so we can have victory because of his sacrifice. We know that we've got our freedom, we've got our future, a future in eternity because he paid with his life. And we know that before he went to the cross, he set up his own remembrance, didn't he? He set up his own remembrance as he sat at the supper table with his disciples and he broke the bread with his hands, which surely would have been nicer than that little bit of wafer that I put in my mouth earlier. And I remember thinking, this is not nice, but it'll do for now. And he said, do this in remembrance of me. Do it in remembrance of me, because Jesus knew that remembering was important, lest we forget. Now, Jewish families gather once a year. Larry, if he was here, would agree with this. They gather once a year for Passover. Manuel himself has often done that at Easter for us, and we've had a mini Passover meal. And they gather, and when they gather, they tell the story of how God rescued their people from captivity and from slavery. And the reason why they do that, lest they forget. And so that every generation that goes on, the children will know the story, and the children of those children will know the story, and the children of those children will know the story, so it doesn't get lost and they don't remember anymore. Now, my own grandfather died. He became a Chelsea pensioner. He was awarded that in the latter years of his life, and he was able to stay in the Chelsea pensioner house. And I've got a fantastic photograph of him lined up with the Chelsea pensioners, with Princess Diana coming past, and she's looking straight at Grandad Jack and speaking to him. It's an amazing picture. Captain Tom Moore, of course, fought his first war in the Second World War, and then he fought his second war when at the age of 99 he decided to walk those 100 lengths of his garden to play his part in the war effort against COVID. Now we know, sadly, he's no longer with us, and soon there'll be nobody left. You know, my dad will not be at the Menin Gate anymore, so there'll be a space where my dad stood. And my hope is that others will carry on and fill the space of all those veterans who can no longer travel because of their mobility, or who've actually passed on themselves. And so it's left to us to carry on the importance of remembering, for as Moses recognized, when peace and prosperity has replaced a nation in captivity, it's easy to forget who delivered you. And I've got two quotes from two different past American presidents because I found them really powerful. Franklin Roosevelt once said, "Those who enjoy such privileges as we enjoy forget in time that men died to win them." And Abraham Lincoln, quite amazing actually, when I read this, Moses saw down the corridors of time to a time when they would forget. So did Rudyard Kipling, and so did Abraham Lincoln. And this is a speech that he made in 1863. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers and wealth and power as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We've forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God who made us." So I'll end with this. Today I really thank God. I do, I thank God, and we hear the rumblings of war, we hear those. But I thank God that our country is not at war, and I thank God that today that we can live in peace, and that today we didn't forget, we remembered. We remembered. Thank you.